Back in the late summer of 2009, I was working on a tugboat that was assisting an oil tanker off the coast of Louisiana. There had been some storms and rough seas, so as much as we weren't in any danger, our tug had been helping to stabilize the tanker, which was way more valuable to the large waves. I always loved the water, and I still do. But on the morning of, I remember, August 17th, as we were guiding that tanker along the coast, something put the love to the test in a big, very bad way. I was in the bathroom when it happened, probably the worst place that you can be when you get hit by a freak wave. I'd been awake for maybe no more than 10 to 15 minutes, and then out of nowhere, everything got turned upside down. 1 second, the toilet was on the floor, and the next, it was on the ceiling. I tried to open the door to the bathroom, but all the lights suddenly went out, and I could hear the bathroom slowly filling with water. I couldn't tell if it was blood or seawater stinging my eyes, and then I finally got the bathroom door open, but I didn't have long to celebrate at all, because I felt this heavy thunk as the tugboat touched down on the seabed at least 100 feet below the surface. When we got the door open, everything was dark, water was everywhere, and I had no idea which way I was facing. Our propeller was up, our wheelhouse was down, and in the alley next to the watertight door which led to an exit hatch, I saw two of my coworkers struggling with the hatch as the water levels continued to rise. I panicked, thinking we'd all drown if we failed to get that door open, so I did something completely against my instincts and dived into the water to look for a different way to escape. I don't imagine many of y'all have been in a shipwreck before, but when your ship goes down like ours did and takes on a ton of water, it rushes through your ship in very odd patterns. Imagine pouring a gallon of water into an ant farm and watch how it reaches some tunnels faster than others and creates little air pockets here and there. Well, that's how I managed to get swept into a second bathroom, this one attached to the second engineer's cabin, and with the door having been swept shut as I pulled it into it, it created one of those air pockets I had just mentioned. At first, the water continued to rise, and I thought that I was going to be trapped in there and drowned. But to my relief, it didn't fill the bathroom completely. It only filled up about a third of the way and then just suddenly stopped. Part of the reason it didn't fill up was because we routinely kept all the cabin doors closed. We did this mainly as a security precaution, but it also secured parts of the ship from flooding and meant that I could cling to a wash basin in my own private air bubble at the bottom of the Gulf. And as I stood there in the darkness, I started to hear my coworkers screaming and yelling. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but I figured that they might have gotten the hatch open. And so, with that in my mind, I decided to do everything I could to swim back to them. But when I tried to pry the bathroom door open, the door handle snapped off of my grip. I remember feeling a panic rising up in me again, one so intense I thought that I might lose my mind right there and then. But then suddenly, it just stopped, and I felt this strange sense of calm wash over me. Everything that had happened over the previous few minutes had been so chaotic and terrifying, but after that door handle snapped off in my hand, it felt like I had control of the situation. I knew where I was, I knew what I needed to do, and I had no choice but to solve the problem of opening the door. It was that, or die trying. And as crazy as it sounds to just think it to myself, all these years later it brought about that strange sense of calm. It was just me and that bathroom door. Whatever came next, we could cross that bridge once we came to it. I remember spotting a vent and thinking that if I pulled off the steel grill that I could probably use it as some kind of tool. Luckily, it was strong enough for me to use to force open the bathroom door. But that wasn't like an instant thing. It took a lot of time and effort, and during the attempt, I heard the cries of my coworkers going silent one by one. I thought they had escaped, but now I know different. Once I had the bathroom door open, I was back in the second engineer's cabin. I saw 2 life jackets, each with a small flashlight attached. I put one in my mouth, lodged the other in the elastic of my underwear, and then attempted to swim for the escape hatch. Outside of the cabin, all of the corridors were full of water, with no air pockets for me to use, meaning every time I ran out of breath, I had to stop trying to open the hatch and swim back to my air pocket in the engineer's cabin to take a breath. The first time I swam back, I almost missed the door to the engineer's cabin. It was dark, all the doors looked the same, and I knew that if I got lost or confused, I'd most likely drown. I later found out the exact same thing happened to a coworker who drowned in the mess room after confusing it for some place with an air pocket. To stop myself from getting turned around, I tore off some fabric from one of the engineer's coveralls, tied it into a rope, and then attached one end to the door of the cabin so I could use it to guide myself back whenever I ran out of breath. I tried again and again, but still the hatch wouldn't budge, and I eventually decided that I should save my strength, stay in my little air pocket, and rethink my attempts to escape. I had to just stay put, stay calm, and think. And I'm not kidding when I say hours went by. I ate tinned sardines and drank canned soda just to keep my energy levels up, but I had to keep my legs out of the water. I knew I'd scraped my leg during one of my escape attempts, and at first I thought the stinging was just the salt water getting into the wounds, but I quickly realized it wasn't just the salt water. It was little crayfish swimming up to pick at the peeling skin around the wound. I also thought the water level would remain stable, but after a while, I realized it was slowly rising from how it seemed to be creeping up the wall. And that's about the time I just accepted that I was going to die. I kept thinking about my family, and it brought me a strange sense of peace knowing that they'd be there to carry on without me. Sure, it had hurt some. My kids would grow up without their father, but they'd no doubt get a big payout from the company. And then on top of my life insurance, they might just get a big enough check to keep them comfy for the rest of their lives, I imagine. And thinking those kinds of thoughts was all I could do to comfort myself, and remember just sitting there, trying to conserve whatever oxygen I had left in total silence, just waiting around to die. Then suddenly, the silence was broken by the sudden sound of metal on metal. It was like a hard clunk, and although I couldn't see what was going on outside the boat, I knew that there was a good chance someone was out there, someone that might be able to hear me. I didn't scream or yell, as that would have burned valuable oxygen. Instead, I started to hammer my fist against the bulkhead, hoping whoever was out there would recognize that someone was alive inside the tug. And minutes later, I saw a light through one of the portholes and realized that there must have been divers swimming around outside. I took a deep breath and then dived back into the water. My goal was to find a porthole through which I could see the divers, so I went room to room, prying open doors, then heading back to the air pocket for another gulp of oxygen. Then back I went, repeating the process over and over until finally I caught sight of the divers outside. I remember pushing my hand up against the safety glass, and one of the divers later said he just thought it was another body at first. But when I started trying to bang on the glass, they realized I was alive. I wasn't taken straight to the surface. You'd think that that might have caused more emotional turmoil than it did, and after being trapped in a wreck like that, most would want to return straight to the surface. But you can't do that. The sudden change in pressure might actually kill you, so I spent a real long time at a diving bell sucking air from a spare oxygen tank before I was allowed to resurface. The divers told me I'd been down there for almost 14 hours. I don't even think it even felt like 3. I guess my sense of time was disoriented, but resurfacing to the night sky instead of daylight made it feel like I'd time traveled or something. A bunch of medics checked my vitals to ensure my temperature and blood pressure were okay, and then they advised that I go visit a hospital. But all I wanted to do was get home to my wife and kids, so although I wouldn't advise anyone to ignore medical advice like that, I went straight home and gave them all the biggest hugs of their lives. I had some real bad dreams for a long time afterward. Sometimes I'd feel like my bed was sinking and I'd wake up with sweat-soaked bed sheets, which I guess prolonged the process of realizing it was just a nightmare. Other times I dreamed that water was rushing in via my bedroom windows and that my wife was unconscious. I'd pick her up, carry her to the door, but it wouldn't open, and the water would just keep rising and rising until I woke up. Some friends suggested that we just take a vacation, someplace really landlocked, And that helped a whole lot. I stayed away from the pool for a whole week and a half, though, until I finally forced myself to face my fears. I guess the context of that vacation helped, knowing that I was safe, and like I said at the start, I've always loved the water. When I was 14 years old, my family and I went on a boating trip out of Melbourne's western Port Bay. I remember being at the helm with my father, steering the little boat over the waves, and then the next thing we knew, my big brother was shouting that water was coming in. And it all happened so fast. Mom and Dad were shouting for us to stay together, and then suddenly, the boat tipped over, and we were in the water. We later found out that the bottom of our boat had been almost completely rotten, and that its owners had been extremely and willfully negligent in renting it to us, and we had no choice but to start swimming. Since it was late in the evening, no one had seen us go down, so it was up to us to rescue ourselves. I was a reasonably good swimmer, and we all had life jackets on, but it was still around 2 miles back to shore, so land looked like it was a long, long way away. Darkness fell as we were swimming, but my dad started to struggle and my big brother swam back to try and help him. My mom and I stuck together and kept going, but we soon lost sight of my father and brother. Seagulls cried out above me, and I kept imagining that they were warning me of an attack from sharks that were no doubt swimming in the waters around us. I could see land, but it didn't seem to get any closer. Finally, after more than 3 hours in that water, I felt the sandy bottom against my feet. I'd reached the mud flats of what I believed was the mainland, but my mom, dad, and brother were nowhere to be seen. I was weak, cold, and exhausted. I dragged myself through the mud, which at some points was almost up to my waist, and this was even more terrifying than the swimming. The mud kept on sucking me down, and I was terrified that I'd sink and be suffocated. My muscles ached, my lungs burned, and I felt like I was about to pass out at points. But at the same time, I knew the clock was ticking, that it was essentially down to me and me alone to get help from my family. The clock was ticking in my head, and I needed to get my family the help they badly needed. When I finally made it ashore, I realized that I was on French Island, an island with an old, disused prison on it that has only about 50 people on it. I ran through the bushland, using up the last reserves of my energy, it felt like, and feeling thorns scratching against my legs and arms. I ran for a long time, too, stopping every so often to catch my breath before continuing through the bush. Finally, I found a house, and after banging on the door, someone opened it and I told them what had happened. I just remember crying and crying as they tried to comfort me, and how I begged them to help find my family. They told me everything was going to be okay, and that they'd contacted the Victoria Coast Guard. I appreciate that they were just trying to console me, but I knew they were wrong. The next morning, the bodies of my mom, dad, and older brother were recovered from the water off the coast of Fairhaven, and words can't express how devastated I was, and I was filled with this overwhelming survivor's guilt, thinking that I should be the one dead. And for 5 long years, I was a wreck, and I think I might be dead from drink and drugs if it wasn't for the birth of my first kid. And for a long, long time, I avoided any kind of large body of water, which included swimming pools, before my therapist suggested that I undertake some exposure therapy. This would involve brief trips to a local pool, but at first, my anxiety was so bad that even if my head was above the water, I just couldn't breathe. I tried for 4 months, but nothing worked until a local swim coach heard my story and offered some help. And then over the next year or so, the therapy started to chip away at my fear until, finally, I was able to look at the sea without feeling like I was about to have a panic attack. My proudest moment has been taking part in a charity swim across the Rip, which is an infamously rough stretch of water. We helped raise money for a domestic violence charity here in Australia, which is a cause very close to my heart for reasons that could well make for another true scary story. It might have taken me 20 years, but I no longer let my fear control me. I now understand that what happened wasn't my fault, But the irony of needing water to heal the very trauma that it created has never been lost on me. Back in late August of 1985, my fiancée and I set out on a 3-week sailing trip. Our job was to sail a 44-foot yacht named Tamaru from French Polynesia to San Francisco, and we were being paid handsomely to do so. We had years of sailing experience between us, but the 4,000-mile journey was the furthest either of us had ever been on. We were confident that we could do it, but early on, there was a worrying change in the weather's forecast. Statistically, hurricanes happen really late in the South Pacific and tend to arrive in mid to late October, so by setting sail in late August, we figured that we'd avoid the worst of the bad weather. But as the saying goes, man proposes, and God disposes. 3 weeks into our voyage, we were faced with a Category 4 hurricane, which whipped up waves as high as 20-story buildings. We'd sailed through gales and storms before, but never a hurricane. We tried to escape it for 3 days, but the boat could only go 15 miles per hour, and so eventually it caught up with us. Once the hurricane hit, it was too late for us to turn around and escape, so we had no choice but to brave it head on. We put on our raincoats and boarded up the yacht, all while 140-mile-per-hour winds and 40-foot waves battered against the boat. The wind and rain felt like BB pellets on our skin, and it was like nothing we'd ever felt before. But we were still confident of being able to handle the situation. We just had to wait for the worst to be over. At one point, I remember heading below deck to get something, and then I suddenly heard my fiancée yell out, "Oh my God!" We got caught in a massive wave. I was thrown off my feet, and the last thing I remember is my head smashing into something before everything just went fuzzy. I think I must have been out for a minute or two because when I woke up, there was blood all over my face and raincoat and I was lying on the floor. I couldn't hear my fiancé, so I went topside to check on him. The last I'd seen of him, he was strapping himself into the safety harness, but when I went to check on him, the harness was empty and he was nowhere to be seen. I remember screaming, but I knew I had to pull myself together. There'd be time to grieve later, and if I didn't focus on the task ahead of me, people would end up grieving me too. I knew the yacht had suffered irreparable damage that would make it impossible to sail. The navigation system, engine, and even the sails were all waterlogged or shredded beyond repair. But even worse, the yacht itself was taking on water at crazy speeds. My instincts kicked in and I started pumping water out of the cabin before using the storm jib and a broken pole to create an improvised sail. The only tools I had at hand were a sextant and a watch, but I had enough sailing experience to use them to navigate to land. After 41 days adrift in the Pacific, rationing my canned food and water, I finally spotted land. It turned out to be the Hawaiian island of Hilo, and as I slowly drifted towards the harbor, I was spotted by a Japanese ship and rescued. And for weeks afterwards, I kept one of my fiancé's old shirts wrapped around my pillow. His scent was the only thing that got me through. I put all the pain and grief to the back of my mind, and once I was safe, it all came gushing out of me like water through a broken dam. And it took me many years to get back to sailing, and these days I'm much more cautious about the jobs I accept. I thought about retiring from it altogether, but after a while I realized that it's where I belong. And if there's one sliver lining to the dark, dark cloud of my fiancé's tragic death, it's that he went out doing what he loved most. On April 17th of 1918, the SS Dumaru set sail from Portland, Oregon, bound for the South Pacific. Owned by the U.S. Shipping Board, the 270-foot, 1,500-ton wooden steamer would transport goods between the United States and the many Philippine islands approximately 7,000 miles to its east. Its manufacturers, the Grant Smith Porter Ship Company, had high hopes for their creation. But right away, ill omens prompted hushed concern. When the ship launched in Portland during the spring of 1918, it tumbled into the water and smashed into several houseboats on the Willamette River. The ship's captain, a hardy Scandinavian named Ole Berenson, dismissed the apprehensions of his anxious crew members, and they set sail for San Francisco during the finer climes of the late summer. The Dumaru departed the United States in September of 1918, made a stop in Hawaii, and then sailed on to Guam. Finally, on October 16th, the ship sailed out of Guam's Apra harbor, destined for the Philippine capital of Manila. Only then was it loaded up with its final cargo, which just so happened to be several thousand gallons of gasoline and a monumental shipment of trinitrotoluene, more commonly known as TNT. As the Dumaru pulled out of Apra harbor, heavy storm clouds gathered on the horizon. Then before long, the storm broke in earnest. The Dumaru crashed through the roaring waves of the Philippine Sea, its crew battling the elements to keep her afloat. And then suddenly, disaster struck. A bolt of lightning streaked through the sky, striking the Dumaru's wooden deck and setting off a chain reaction which ignited both the shipment of gasoline and the crates full of dynamite. In the year that followed, survivor Theron Bean stated that the forwardmost portion of the ship simply erupted into flame following the bright white flash. Soon after, the call went out to abandon ship. The ship's crew rushed aboard its three-life vessel, which consisted of a small raft and 2 boats. But in their panic, the men failed to evenly distribute themselves between the 3 vessels. This meant that while one of the lifeboats departed with just 9 people aboard and 11 empty seats, the other became dangerously overloaded, with over 30 terrified sailors hanging on for dear life. Soon after, the 3 vessels were separated by rough seas. On October 26th of 1918, the Sunday Oregonian reported that Captain Berenson, his second mate, and 3 crew members had been found alive and well. They had been picked up by a transport ship just 9 days after the Dumaru exploded. Their quest for survival was over. Their shipmates, on the other hand, were not so fortunate. Theron Bean, who found himself crammed aboard the boat of 32, stated that they rode through the night until finally the rising sun revealed Guam on the horizon. Yet the Dumaru's survivors were horrified when a sudden change of wind and current sent their boat off course. Floating aimlessly in the Philippine Sea, the men's hopes were reignited by the sudden appearance of a passing steamer. They began frantically rowing in its direction, waving and shouting as they went, but frustratingly, they remained unspotted as it sailed past them and into the distance. For the next few days, the sailors hoped and prayed for favorable winds, but as time passed, the situation grew critical. Their daily rations allowed for only 2 tablespoons of water and 1 piece of hard tack, and then after 7 days of drifting, they found themselves too weak to row. Around 2 weeks into their ordeal, the first of the survivors began to die from exposure. 3 days later, they ran out of hard tack, while the heavens had failed to provide them with a single drop of rain. Some grew so thirsty that they began to drink salt water. All who did so died in agony just hours after their first sip. Other savvier sailors fashioned a makeshift catchment device, otherwise known as an evaporator, using their shoes, the boat's oars, along with some spare wood they'd managed to chip away from it, with which to fuel a small fire. It was a creative but futile attempt to replenish their water supplies, and ultimately, they decided that desperate times called for desperate measures. After a brief but confrontational discussion, one of the starving sailors took a rubber hose from a bailing pump and fashioned it into a makeshift fishing line. He then took a knife, began carving off pieces of his dead shipmate's flesh, and after tying the meat to the improvised fishing line, used it as bait to attract nearby schools of fish. Eventually, a group of dolphins passed by, and after luring one ever closer with the tempting taste of human flesh, the sailors speared it, killed it, and butchered it. Theron Bean later wrote that the dolphin's meat and moisture were warmly welcomed, but scarcely comments on the method by which it was obtained. Finally, on the 24th day of their ordeal, the survivors of the SS Dumaru began to drift towards land. There had been weak celebration upon its sighting, and for the first time in weeks, the men felt some semblance of hope return. Little did they know, but the worst was yet to come. As their lifeboat approached white tropical sands, choppy waves caused it to capsize. The surviving sailors were tossed among a seabed strewn with jagged, skeletal coral, inflicting terrible gashes and scrapes to their tender, sunburned skin. Some men were simply too weak to swim to shore and drowned among the coral, failing at the final hurdle in a tragic turn of events. Of the 32 men who climbed in the Dumaru's lifeboat on the day it exploded, only 14 of them lived to tell the tale. Those that returned were treated as minor celebrities and, like Theron Bean, were venerated by a sympathetic media that was already buzzing with excitement over the Great War in Europe. They were treated as men of grit, will, and determination, while those who died were revered as great Americans, men who braved wild frontiers not just for their own enrichment, but for the benefit of their families and their nation. Theron Bean claimed that, upon their passing, his fallen comrades were given a respectful burial at sea, but the truth was deeply and disturbingly different. Almost 12 years later, on January 1st of the year 1930, a man named Lowell Thomas published a book which stunned the American maritime community. It was entitled The Wreck of the Dumaru, A Story of Cannibalism. In his book, Mr. Thomas claimed that after extensive interviews with one of the ship's survivors who wished to remain anonymous, he was quite certain that the shipwrecked sailors of the SS Dumaru had resorted to cannibalism in order to survive. The book caused outrage and indignation among the vast swaths of the American public, so much so that a reporter from the New York Times was tasked with verifying Mr. Thomas's account. This reporter subsequently discovered that not only was Mr. Thomas's source a reliable one, being the Dumaru's assistant engineer, Fred Harmon, but his narrative was identical to the U.S. Navy's own official version of the incident. According to the report, taken from a U.S. naval base in the Philippine Islands, 4 of the Dumaru survivors passed away on the 18th day of their ordeal. One of these men, the ship's first engineer, has supposedly permitted his fellow sailors to consume his flesh upon his passing, and so they did. After carving off pieces of the dead man's flesh, the surviving sailors boiled the meat in a kerosene can. It tasted good, the assistant engineer reportedly stated. Everyone seemed to feel a little bit better. The next day, the survivors ate a little more, but this time, Harmon reported that the amount of salt in the meat made everyone sick and crazy. Harmon also stated that the proposal to cannibalize the dead was the suggestion of a Greek sailor he referred to as George. Wielding a hatchet, George was alleged to have demanded that they consume the flesh of the fallen. "We're all dying," he reportedly yelled. "Cook the chief, or I'll do it myself." Finally, on the orders of the Dumaru's first mate, George the Greek prepared the flesh of the dead men for consumption, and did so under the watchful eye of a lieutenant named E.V. Holmes. The lieutenant went ahead and ordered the Greek to place small parts of flesh on the wooden boat baler that was shaped like a large sugar scoop, and then wash them in the sea, Harmon said. Afterward, the wooden baler was passed around to all. Harmon went on to state that George the Greek ate first and then, I quote, offered the flesh to Holmes, who took it and ate it, thereby showing the rest of us that he desired us to do likewise. We ourselves had come around to George's way of thinking, and we decided to go right on with what the Greeks started. Though the men had initially been horrified at the idea of eating their crewmates, they eventually agreed that it was, and I quote, the only possible means of saving our lives, and for our comrades it was a fate not much worse than to be eaten by sharks. After eating the head engineer, they allegedly also ate a Hawaiian mess boy who had grown so weak that he couldn't move. Following the publication of Lowell Thomas's highly controversial account, the Dumaru's survivors admitted that the reports of cannibalism were true. However, the Connecticut Examiner went on to report that, quote, speculation still persisted about several disappearances, speculating that some men jumped overboard and became shark food rather than risk being eaten by their comrades. and grisly unsubstantiated rumors of casting lots before an unlucky chief engineer and Hawaiian mess boy were killed, cooked, and eaten. Reports of cannibalism and the allegations of voluntary deaths include details that are beyond horrifying. But perhaps one of the more subtly chilling aspects of this case is that, had it not been for a shift in the wind, or had the passing steamer noticed the small lifeboat and come to its rescue, this grisly and terrifying episode might well have been averted entirely. In October of the year 1725, a British trading ship known as the Luxborough Galley set sail from the coasts of southern England. Under the supervision of Captain William Calloway, the Luxborough was to complete a triangular trade route for the South Sea Company, transporting cotton, slaves, and rum between the Americas, Africa, and Europe. In the years that followed, the vessels suffered considerable misfortune. In one incident, more than 600 African slaves perished after an outbreak of smallpox, accounting for just over a third of its human cargo. Many believed that such a huge loss of life had left the Luxborough haunted, and that it was only a matter of time before the dead sought retribution against those who sailed her. It took until June of 1727 for their grim portents to bear fruit, but when they did, the results were catastrophic. After hauling a cargo of rum and sugar across the Atlantic, the Luxborough caught fire during the return leg of its journey. According to a 24-year-old second mate named William Boys, who had served in the Royal Navy since his 14th birthday, the fire was started by two young cabin boys who noticed liquid dripping down a column of wood. Worried that there was a leak in the ship's hull, the two boys sought a candle to better illuminate their surroundings, but upon raising the candle above their heads, the liquid burst into flame. It wasn't water leaking from the ship's hull. It was rum leaking from a poorly sealed barrel. Within minutes, a fiery explosion doused the hold in flames, and despite the efforts of the ship's crew, the conflagration grew. When it became evident that their attempts were futile, and fearing the ship's supply of gunpowder was about to explode, many of the crew simply dropped to their knees and began praying for their mortal souls. Others rushed for its escape vessel, a 16-foot yawl containing 3 oars. Within minutes, the tiny boat was filled beyond capacity with 22 men and boys, and 16 souls were left behind. A handful had opted to go down with the ship, but many more were asphyxiated as they attempted to commandeer a second lifeboat. The survivors rowed like madmen, trying to put as much distance as possible between themselves and the coming explosion. When it came, it showered the surrounding ocean with splinters and scorched human remains. Those who rushed the yawl had survived the explosion, but they were now faced with a new and potentially deadly dilemma. They were stranded in the middle of the Atlantic, with no food or water and no means of sheltering themselves from the scorching summer sun. After 2 weeks of drifting aimlessly among the waves, the number of survivors had dwindled from 22 to just 12. It's believed that even more would have perished in the coming days if it weren't for the decisive actions of some Newfoundland fishermen who spotted the drifting vessel during a routine trip. Sadly, despite his rescue, Captain William Calloway passed away the day afterward and was joined by 6 more of his sickly shipmates in the weeks that followed. Only 5 of the Luxborough's crew made it home, and although 2 of their names have been lost to history, 3 remain on record. William Boys, the shipmate's second mate, who had been a 24-year-old veteran of 10 years at the time of the disaster, lived to the ripe old age of 74. The ship's surgeon, Dr. Scrimsor, passed away aged 80. Yet perhaps most pertinent to our story is a sailor named George Mould, who died at Greenwich Hospital, aged 82. One of George Mould's physicians at Greenwich Hospital was Dr. William Boys, Jr., the son of the identically named Luxborough survivor. Not only had Dr. Boys heard his father's tale of survival on scores of separate occasions, but he'd also conducted extensive interviews with his patient, George Mould. That meant that upon the passing of the Luxborough survivors, Dr. Boys was perhaps the preeminent authority on the disaster and the survival of those that escaped it. Then, with a knowledge gleaned from his father and patient, the good doctor put pen to paper. His 1787 account of the Luxborough disaster was picked up by newspapers on both sides of the Atlantic. Readers of the Boston Gazette and London's Evening Post were riveted by the events leading up to the ship's sinking, and marveled at how they improvised a sail and engineered methods of obtaining fresh water. But it was the account of the survivors' fifth day at sea which caused international consternation. And what follows is an excerpt from that account. We often saw birds flying over our heads and fish playing around the boat's stern, which we strove to catch with our hat bands knotted together and a pin for a hook baited with a piece of the dead men's bodies, but with all our contrivance could not catch either fish or bird. The sensation of hunger was not so urgent, but we all saw the necessity of recruiting our bodies with some more substantial nourishment. It was at this time that we found ourselves impelled to adopt the horrible expedient of eating part of the bodies of our dead companions and drinking their blood. Our surgeon, Mr. Scrimsor, a man of the utmost humanity, first suggested the idea and, resolute to set us an example, ate the first morsel himself. But at the second mouthful, he turned his face away from as many as he could and wept. With great reluctance, we brought ourselves to try different parts of the bodies of 6, but could relish only the hearts, of which we ate 3, but we drank the blood of 4. By cutting the throat a little, while after death we collected a little more than a pint from each body. Here I cannot but mention the particular respect shown by the men to the officers, for the men who were employed in the melancholy business of collecting the blood in a pewter basin that was in the boat, and the rest of the people would never touch a drop till the captain, surgeon, and myself had taken as much as we thought proper. And I can truly affirm we were so affected by the strong instance of their regard that we always left them a larger share than of right belonged to them. This expedient, so shocking in relation and so distressing to us in the use, was undoubtedly the means of preserving those who survived, as we constantly found ourselves refreshed and invigorated by this nourishment, however unnatural. Obviously, since the vast majority of those who'd cannibalized their shipmates had passed away, no charges could be brought against any of the survivors. But to this day, the episode remains one of the darkest chapters in British maritime history. On May 19th of 1884, a yacht known as the Mignonette departed the English port of Southampton, bound for the coasts of eastern Australia. Constructed in 1867, the 52-foot cruiser had been purchased by an Australian lawyer named Jack Want, who sought a suitable crew to transport her to Sydney. But it was no small feat. Many experienced sailors noted that the yacht was an inshore boat, unsuited to long voyages in open waters. And what's more, even the most experienced of sailors were intimidated by the 15,000-mile journey, with many turning the job offer down before a full crew was finally assembled. In the end, a 4-man team was put together which consisted of Captain Tom Dudley, Edwin Stevens, Edmund Brooks, and a 17-year-old cabin boy by the name of Richard Parker. Almost 2 months into their journey, the crew of the Mignonette found themselves sailing into a gale around 1,600 miles northwest of South Africa's Cape of Good Hope. Despite the fierce winds, their journey was progressing steadily. Then, in order to enjoy a good night's sleep, Captain Dudley gave the order to heave to. In sailing, heaving to is a way of slowing a vessel's forward progress, as well as fixing the helm and sail position so that the vessel does not have to be steered. It is commonly used as a way for sailors to take a break or to wait out strong or contrary winds. However, just as the maneuver was completed, and young Richard Parker was sent below to prepare tea, a freak wave struck the Mignonette, damaging a bulkhead and causing vast amounts of seawater to flood into her hold. Realizing the yacht was doomed, Captain Dudley ordered his 3 crew members to man their single 13-foot lifeboat. The lifeboat was of flimsy construction, with its boards only a 1/4 inch thick, but As the mignonette began to list and groan, it proved the crew's only source of salvation. Just minutes later, the crew watched as the mignonette disappeared below the waves, having managed to salvage nothing but a few pieces of navigational equipment and 2 tins of turnips. At first, Captain Dudley managed to stabilize the lifeboat by constructing an improvised sea anchor, a device reminiscent of a kind of waterborne parachute. It dragged behind the lifeboat, slowing its progress slightly and allowing for more effective manual steering. The captain also determined that they must have been around 700 miles from the nearest dry land, meaning that they were unlikely to be rescued anytime soon. During their first night at sea, the crew were forced to fight off a great white shark using nothing but their oars. The next morning, they were able to catch a sea turtle by simply dragging it out of the water. This yielded about 3 pounds of meat each, plus the bones, which, along with the tins of turnips, lasted until July 17th. The sailors planned on drinking the turtle's blood to stave off fatal dehydration, but after it became contaminated with seawater, they began imbibing their own urine. By July 20th, the teenage cabin boy Richard Parker had become so sick of drinking his own urine that he began slurping up handfuls of seawater. But this only exacerbated his dangerous levels of dehydration, and he fell unconscious shortly afterward. Around the same time that young Parker began to drift into unconsciousness, Dudley, Stevens, and Brooks began discussing the prospect of cannibalism. On July 24th, Dudley told the others that it was better that one of them die so that the others would survive and suggested they should draw lots. Brooks refused, but that night, Dudley once again raised the matter and pointed out that while the childless cabin boy was most probably dying, he and Stevens had wives and families to take care of. The boy would be mourned, but unlike their women and children, his parents would not starve without his wages. This appeared to have been the most effective method of argument, as the next morning, Captain Dudley and Edwin Stevens made the decision to kill Richard Parker, as doing so prior to his natural death would ensure his blood was fresh enough to drink. Brooks, who had refused to take part in the earlier discussion, claimed he neither agreed nor disagreed with the decision. Captain Dudley then said a prayer, and with Stevens holding the boy still in the event that he woke up, the captain pushed his penknife into Parker's jugular vein and ended his life. Once Parker's heart had ceased to beat, the 3 surviving sailors began butchering his body. Ironically, and despite his early reticence, it was reported that Edmund Brooks was ravenous in his consumption of Parker's flesh, while Edwin Stevens appeared to have a change of heart and ate very little. Speaking of the scene that followed, Captain Dudley later said, "I can assure you I shall never forget the sight of my 2 unfortunate companions over that ghastly meal. We were like mad wolves who should get the most, and for men, fathers of children, to commit such a deed, we could not have our right reason." Just a few days later, the survivors were still feasting on Parker's remains when they spotted the sail of a passing ship named the Montezuma and successfully garnered its attention. Finally, on September 6th of 1884, the Montezuma sailed into Falmouth Harbor, where the 3 survivors of the mignonette reported to a customs officer by the name of Mr. Cheeseman. Initially, the men were greeted with great relief, as it was assumed the mignonette's crew had been lost when it failed to reach its Cape Town checkpoint. Yet after explaining the grisly methods by which they had survived, the situation took a dramatic turn. Incredibly, the surviving crew members were remarkably candid regarding their retelling of the events and openly admitted to having murdered young Richard Parker before consuming his still warm flesh. Contemporary defense attorneys, who tend to limit their clients' vocabulary to the words "no" and "comment," would consider such a frank admission to be nothing short of madness. But although Captain Dudley and his 2 surviving crew members felt deep shame and guilt, they were comfortable in their confession, because in doing so, they invoked what was known as the custom of the sea. Since the very first days of humanity's oceanic exploration, accidents and misfortune have humbled even the hardiest of vessels, and those who survived their sinking ships, either cast adrift or washed up on some far-flung shore, were often faced with what was referred to as the delicate question: to eat or not to eat their dead or dying shipmates. Thankfully, only a very small number of seamen and explorers have been faced with such a grim situation, but with 19th century British culture being so centered around its maritime industries, such incidents became embedded into the public consciousness. For example, in the early 1600s, 7 English sailors were cruising through the Caribbean when they were blown out to sea and cast adrift for 17 days. When they reached the point of starvation, the sailors drew straws to decide who would sacrifice their flesh for the good of the collective. Ironically, the man chosen was the one who suggested the idea in the first place, but according to his shipmates, he nobly consented and was swiftly put to death. The sailors survived on the man's flesh till they reached the Isle of St. Martin, then following the repatriation to British territory, they were put on trial for murder. However, on the day of their hearing, the colonial judge showed a great deal of sympathy towards them, which in turn reflected the views of the wider public. The sailors were pardoned, with the judge stating their actions were of inevitable necessity. More than 200 years later, consuming one's dead shipmates in order to survive periods of deprivation became known as the tradition of the sea. And as recently as August of 1874, the crew of the collier Euxine was said to have resorted to cannibalism after their ship went down off the coast of Western Australia. The governor of Singapore had ordered the surviving crew members arrested, and at first, the British government encouraged him to hold a judicial inquiry. However, when it came time to actually prosecuting the men, extended procedural wrangling meant that charges were eventually dropped, and this was no accident. During this period, the influence of British admiralty over their counterparts in government cannot be overstated. Many serving members of Parliament had been officers in Her Majesty's Royal Navy prior to their retirements, so naturally, they had a great deal of sympathy for the survivors of any shipwreck. This didn't mean sailors were free to murder and cannibalize as they pleased, so long as it was on the high seas. But under the right circumstances, invoking the custom of the sea could prove a powerful defense, and the surviving crew members of the Mignonette knew this all too well. Yet after relaying their story of survival to the Falmouth customs officer, the deliciously named Mr. Cheeseman, the survivors found themselves standing before a police officer named Sergeant Laverty, and they were informed that, although they were not being placed under arrest, they were not permitted to leave Falmouth until the situation had been resolved. In the hours that followed, an emergency meeting of the harbor's commissioners yielded the following report. The police have apprehended Thomas Dudley, Ed Stevens, and E. Brooks of the yacht Mignonette on a charge of killing at sea on the 20th of July last, the boy Richard Parker after being for 18 days at sea with no food or drink. Summonses were also served on 2 seamen of the German bark Montezuma, as witnesses in the case being those who cleared the boat of the remains of Parker. When news of the macabre story spread around Falmouth, there seemed to be a surprising amount of sympathy for the Mignonette survivors. When they were officially arrested, a local businessman named John Burton paid a generous amount to bail them out of prison, and even though he had eaten heartily of Parker's butchered flesh, there were deafening cries for clemency when it was heard that Edmund Brooks had refused to take part in the boy's murder. Brooks was acquitted, but despite the controversy, Ed Stevens and Captain Dudley were to be put on trial for murder. Following their transfer to an Exeter courthouse, Stevens and Dudley were found guilty of Richard Parker's murder and condemned to hang. Yet, as one might imagine, the decision was met with outrage from both the Admiralty and the wider British public. And finally, after lengthy and considerable pressure, the death warrants for Stevens and Dudley were torn up, and their sentences were reduced to a mere 6 months' imprisonment. The case of the Crown versus Dudley and Stevens is one of the few 19th century criminal procedures still analyzed by law students today. It was also the inspiration for the name of the Bengal tiger in Jan Martel's work Life of Pi. Some mistakenly believe that the case also inspired Edgar Allan Poe's only complete novel, The Narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym of Nantucket, and it's easy to understand why. Told from the perspective of the eponymous Gordon Pym, it recounts the tale of a perilous sea voyage in which, following a mutiny and monstrous storm, Pym finds himself in charge of the ship's battered remains and accompanied by just 3 others, Augustus, Peters, and a young cabin boy by the name of Richard Parker. Halfway through the novel, having survived for days on nothing but scraps of turtle meat and drops of fresh water, the desperate survivors are forced to invoke the so-called custom of the sea and begin drawing lots to determine the victim. In the end, it comes down to just Gordon Pym and Richard Parker, and it is Parker who was chosen to be eaten. Yet, the narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym of Nantucket was not published in the aftermath of the Mignonette's sinking. It was published in 1838, a full 46 years before the Mignonette sank, and 29 years before Richard Parker, the ill-fated cabin boy, was even conceived. Some suggested this was evidence of Poe's morbid prescience, a symptom of his ever-lingering genius. But perhaps such a coincidence is suggestive of the repetitive and inevitable nature of the event itself. For since the very first days of humanity's oceanic exploration, accidents and misfortune have humbled even the hardiest of vessels. And so perhaps those who survived disasters involving interstellar starships, who ended up stranded on some far-flung shore, will once again be faced with what was once referred to as the delicate question. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 7 p.m. EST, and there are super fun live streams on Sundays and Wednesday nights. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/Let'sReadOfficial, or over email, and you might even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks offered from members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories and big compilations, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. All links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends, and remember to always click it or tick it.